only affirmative acts directed at migratory birds, not passive impacts from otherwise lawful activities. And I recognize many people disagree. So do many circuit courts. But at least I would hope you would agree that the fact that we have a major circuit court split and dueling solicitor opinions on this very issue suggests that this is not merely reaffirming the unambiguous intent of Congress. But because we're talking about amending the MBTA, the task at hand is less about interpreting prior intent and more about providing clear direction going forward. At a minimum, I would say that requires acknowledging that this bill would significantly change and expand the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The bill adds incidental take to the scope of activities prohibited by the MBTA, and it defines incidental take as, quote, the killing or taking of migratory birds that directly and foreseeably results from, but is not the purpose of, a covered commercial activity. As such, under the draft bill, incidental take becomes a prohibited criminal offense only if the activity causing it is commercial in nature. Covered commercial activity and covered commercial activities are then defined as an industry or type of commercial activity that the Secretary determines causes significant harm to migratory birds. Then it goes on to list 5 activities presumably predetermined to cause significant harm. In all other respects, the determination of what constitutes a covered commercial activity is left to the Department of Interior. And this is important. The draft bill criminalizes incidental take only when they occur in those activities deemed covered commercial activities. The bill would therefore give the Department of Interior broad authority to select which industries it would expose to significant criminal liability and which industries it would insulate from such liability. In addition to some concerns about vagueness and the capriciousness of singling out specific industries for criminal liability, this presents a major delegation issue. It is the legislature's obligation alone to determine what actions are crimes. And I'm glad we're here to do just that. I have a number of other things, but I'm running out of time. I would just say that I truly am here in the hopes of a constructive discussion and to hopefully contribute to it. I think there's a couple of other issues with the bill, but I think it's profoundly important that Congress is asserting its will and intent and taking a greater role in asserting federal environmental policy. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. D'Angelo. We'll now turn to member questions. Mr. Costa has a commitment, and so we've agreed to begin with him. Mr. Costa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman of the Subcommittee, for your courtesy and for members of the Subcommittee. I think the 3 panels combined are very good witnesses on behalf of meritorious pieces of legislation that we will be considering and amending, and I look forward to having the opportunity to contribute to that effort. I do, because of a potential conflict, would like to speak on H.R. 2473, in which our colleague, Mr. Harder, testified earlier. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 2473, the Save Water Resources Act, this is an important piece of water legislation that provides additional tools in our water toolbox to provide solutions to sustain California's water resources. We are going to have a very good witness on the 3rd panel, a person who I've worked with over the years, Ms. Thea G. Hansen, General Manager of Del Porto Water District. She and I have worked on previous projects before, a very innovative reuse project that now is an implementation that ultimately will provide 58,000 acre-feet of reuse of water. The project that she and the exchange contractors with another very good general manager, Chris White, who works on behalf of the exchange contractors, talks about the innovation that we have in California with our water districts, working in partnership with one another, both on local, state, and federal projects. And the Canyon project, the Del Porto Canyon project, is such a off-site reservoir that would benefit from the passage of H.R. 2473, which is among many reasons why I'm supporting this piece of legislation. It creates a water infrastructure fund. Potentially these funds could go to a lot of projects like the Canyon project. It supports water storage. This canyon project is not only an infrastructure project, but it's a water storage facility that has no opposition that I am aware of. It provides $100 million for storage funding. It provides a monetary prize, as Congressman Harder said, for innovative water technology. We are at the cutting edge. Some of the most innovative water technology and efficiencies have been practiced for decades because water is so valuable, and because of the drought conditions. And people talk about the Israelis, and I've been to Israel, and they do incredible things, but I started an exchange 20 years ago between the Israelis and Fresno State, and many of our water districts implement 95% drip irrigation and more to conserve this very valuable water. But this monetary prize can be helpful. It provides reclamation for infrastructure and finance innovation funding. It provides reauthorization for rural water supply for our clean drinking water. We have, sadly, hundreds and thousands of people in the valley alone that live in communities that don't benefit from clean drinking water standards, and we can fix that. The states come up with significant funding for that purpose. This funding in this area will complement the state funding to improve drinking water for citizens, not only in California, but throughout the country. It also invests in additional water recycling and reuse, just like the project that Del Porto did with the cities of Turlock and Modesto. These kinds of reuse projects are more and more being implemented on the local level because it works and it makes sense. And it would also provide, in California, we've got probably one of the most historical and difficult pieces of state legislation that was implemented 2 years ago called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, otherwise known as SGMA. This is a very important piece of legislation. We're trying to manage balancing the overdraft that is taking place in our groundwater basins. It's not easy. The state law would require our water districts by the year 2040 to come in balance. It's the old adage, if you go to a bank and you make withdrawals and you don't make any deposits, you can only do that for so long. And we understand the critical need of the overdraft of our communities. This legislation, if passed and become into law, would provide another tool for our water districts to come into compliance with this historical law in California. So there are many, many good reasons to support H.R. 2473. I know that Thea Hansen will make a strong statement on behalf of the legislation and all the good things she and the other water managers are doing in the San Joaquin Valley. I thank the chairman for allowing me to go out of order and to recognize this witness, and I look forward to working with the subcommittee on this and other important pieces of legislation.
I thank the gentleman. We will now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to just begin by thanking our ranking member for so clearly summarizing our many concerns this morning in his opening statement. Associate myself with that. Mr. D'Angelo, in your testimony, you raised a series of concerns about this bill, and I think you rightfully pointed out that one of the core issues with our environmental laws at large is that Congress has ceded a tremendous amount of our authority in this arena to the executive branch. And you point out the difficulty in dealing with a pendulum that seems to swing back and forth every time there's a new occupant in the White House. And I'm afraid you're correct in your assessment that this bill would do nothing to provide certainty in the execution and enforcement of the MBTA. This bill would require a permit to conduct, quote, covered commercial activities, unquote, if the activity would result in the harming of migratory birds, while the text explicitly states that 5 activities implicating our energy and telecommunications industries would require permits. It grants the Secretary discretion to require permits to conduct any number of other activities that he deems would cause significant harm to migratory birds. In effect, under this bill, the Secretary gets to decide what counts and what doesn't count as an activity that requires a permit. This type of language should concern every American. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who has infrastructure projects in my district that have been held up by bureaucratic delay after delay and burdensome environmental reviews. And at some point, we have to take ownership of our Article I powers again. So here's the question, Mr. D'Angelo. In your testimony, you highlight the good work that FWS and industry groups have done in protecting migratory birds. Can you give us just a few examples of this?
Sure, and thank you for the question. I first want to put the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in context in that this is, Migratory Bird Treaty Act is not the sole means by which species are protected, right? Half a decade later, the pit bull of environmental laws, the Endangered Species Act was promulgated, and that has specific language, right? And so any species that is endangered, which is on the brink of extinction, per definition, or threatened, which is likely to become so in the foreseeable future can go at 100 years. In some cases, the Fish and Wildlife Service. There's a means to protect them. There's also many other means through how industry operates on federal lands, state laws, and voluntary procedures. So, the threats that you have seen alleged and that are among those of the 5 listed in this in the bill, one, are not the largest threats to or risks to migratory birds, but they're subject to a wide variety of both actual regulatory restrictions under other statutes and other jurisdictions, and a wide range of voluntary efforts and protections.
And how do you think the potential criminal exposure that could arise from this bill would impact industry involvement in protecting migratory birds above what's explicitly required by the law?
Well, right now, prior to the recent M opinion, and certain courts of appeals have said that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act does allow for strict liability, criminal liability, go to jail, for incidental takes, inadvertent takes. So this has been a sort of Damocles that has been hanging over industry for some time. It is, why everyone is told that is not a big deal is because that Fish and Wildlife Service will be judicious and that we should all just rely on prosecutorial discretion. Don't worry, we're from the government. We're here to help.
Very little comfort.
Yeah. I think that's problematic because under the prior interpretations, which only really they don't go back to 1918. It really is the case that sort of any activity could cause you to be criminally liability. Birds of a feather are flocking outside, and if you hit them with a lime scooter, you could be criminally liable under these more extreme interpretations. It's not just commercial activity. It's not just industry. It's everything we do.
It's a very real non-hypothetical threat. Switching gears real quick, I got 30 seconds left. In your testimony, you state the bill's list of 5 covered commercial activities does not represent the activities responsible for the most incidental takes, right? So which activities actually do account for those?
Well, it's true that it's cats are the number one killer of migratory birds, and buildings. About 600 million birds per year is what's estimated. There's a lot of problems with all the numbers, but automobiles, about 200 million.
Wind farms?
Wind farms as well. The numbers have changed on that, but I think the most accurate numbers, Dr. Rodenwald may know best, but around half a million birds per year. But yes, right? And so, just one particular example is of the 5 activities that are called out are gas vents and flares. I spent 4 hours last night trying to find any evidence anywhere of what the annual risk is from flares. Best I could find was assertion that there was an event that caused a death of 7,500 birds, but that was rare, deemed rare by the zoologist who studied it. And yet here it is among the 5. I think Fish and Wildlife Service has done a really good job in protecting species through collaboration with industry. I would caution against something that feels like targeting, and in this case where we don't even have any data on something being a risk, and it's included within 5, one of 5 of countless activities that could take an incidental.
I have to ask you to wrap up, Mr. D'Angelo.
I apologize. It appears arbitrary.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And Mr. Schmidt, on this subject of the incidental take authority under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, I am struggling with what seems like quite a contradiction. On the one hand, the ranking members offered a withering criticism of this bill that would simply affirm this long-standing incidental take authority. On the other hand, he's the co-sponsor of legislation that invokes and affirms this incidental take authority in the context of criticizing the Green New Deal and saying that wind energy would be detrimental to migratory birds, including golden eagles. So it seems from across the aisle we have this stringent standard for renewables on the one hand and no standard for fossil fuel projects on the other, which doesn't seem very tenable. Mr. Schmidt, would you agree that the Fish and Wildlife Service right now has the authority to regulate incidental take under the MBTA?
Yes, the law provides that. I'm on. No, you just turned me off. Yes, the law provides that. However, the recent M opinion, which is a subject of much discussion here, has essentially by decree withdrawn that authority
Right.
from their agents. So
Right, but this
there are no
legislation-
special agents that will be pursuing negligent criminal behavior that was unintended but yet negligent currently.
Just to clarify, Mr. Lowenthal's legislation would not change existing authority, it would affirm it, correct?
Correct.
Talk to me about your understanding of how industries are currently planning their projects. Industries typically like to have certainty. They look at a long-term planning horizon when they put these plans in place. Isn't it best to have a consistent, predictable policy for long-term investments in these projects? And what's your understanding of how industry is approaching this in light of the moving goalpost lately from the Trump administration?
I would say that the lack of certainty is not new. The fact that there has not been a regulatory management program in place that provides that great certainty, it has been a problem. And companies demand and expect certainty as they move forward in investments. It seems to me that a program that is described, albeit maybe not perfect, under this legislation would provide the certainty that they could move forward with their investments while managing with reasonable measures to benefit birds or to protect birds, as the legislation indicates.
Appreciate that. Dr. Rodewald, some folks are presenting what seems like a false choice between acting on climate change and protecting birds from renewable energy development. I'd like to believe these two goals could go hand in hand. So talk about how reducing emissions and keeping global temperature change as low as possible would benefit birds.
Sure, thank you. So there, as I mentioned, there are many threats that are diverse and diffuse that birds are facing. So climate change is one of those. And so all of the steps we can take to reduce emissions have positive outcomes for protecting sometimes very sensitive ecosystems that will be directly impacted by sea rise, for example, salt marshes, changes in terms of forest composition and forest health. We're having more problems with disease and outbreaks in many regions, droughts, wildfires, some of which are natural, some of which are also exacerbated by the conditions that we face. So there are many ways that efforts to stem climate change are supporting healthy habitats for birds, as well as the food resources they need, or water supplies and species that they coexist with.
How about the flip side of that argument, that if we reduce emissions through renewables, we're going to kill too many birds?
Yeah, there's all activities that we do are going to have some impacts on the environment. The question is not do we or do we not pursue certain forms of renewable energy. It's a matter of how we do that. And the Act and the agencies that have been implementing this Act and other ones that protect our environment and regulate human activities do show that there are active steps people and industries can take to reduce their harm. Those can be accommodated.
And renewable energy projects are already doing this, correct?
They are indeed. Yes, we've seen a lot of positive and proactive measures taken by the industry to reduce their harm.
All right, thank you very much. Is it Fulcher next? The chair now recognizes Mr. Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was wondering if the sponsor, primary sponsor for H.R. 2685 would yield to a question, please. Mr. Van Drew.
Of 2685.
Yes,
Mr.
sorry.
Andrew.
Yeah. Mr. Van Drew, would you yield? Could you share fiscal cost or fiscal impact of...
Just quickly, thank you for the question. And, just quickly, that's going to be up to Congress, obviously, and it depends on what we appropriate for it. It's a very important bill because the question would be, what is the cost if we don't do it? This is certainly an important part of our economy and an important part of our natural resources. So as the process goes along, Congress is going to make a decision as to what the appropriation will be. I could currently find out, and we will look into that, what the appropriation is set at now, but we would find out in the future. And that would be up to you and all of us.
If the representative would just perhaps share, as you can, what historically that's been, I'd like to know that, just so we have a general idea of what this is likely to cost.
Okay, historically, it has been nothing.
So,
Historically, as far as I know, there has been no cost associated with it. There's been no appropriation.
okay, so this is, although this is a reauthorization, there has been no fiscal expenditure to your knowledge?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fender. Question for Mr. D'Angelo?
Yes.
What's the most appropriate way to measure success of taking this action? I'm talking specifically about HR 2685, the reauthorization of that. So apparently we haven't spent any funds on that yet. And so by reauthorizing this, there may or may not be appropriations associated with it. I guess what I'm trying to figure out, Mr. D'Angelo, is what's it going to cost? We don't know that. And then how do we measure if spending that money is a good expenditure of taxpayer dollars? Can you help me at all in understanding how we might measure success if this was approved and appropriated?
I will admit to not being an expert in this aspect, the Wild Bird Conservation Act. I can tell you with respect to the Endangered Species Act, the way success is measured is recovery, where populations recover to the point where they no longer need protection or to be listed. And so that is based on establishment of a recovery plan, an examination to look at are the species that are on the brink of extinction or likely to become so, have the risks been mitigated and population issues been addressed to such that they no longer need protection. That's, that in itself has costs in evaluating success in those terms. I don't know of a specific measure that comes within this act, but from a scientific perspective, there are surveys done. There are species of management concern that the Fish and Wildlife Service tracks. It's about 500 species, and other focal species that they use as indicators of the overall success and the overall population health of migratory birds and other birds in their jurisdiction. Those would potentially provide data that would be relevant to show impacts and costs and whether it's money well spent.
Thank you, Mr. D'Angelo. And this is one of the issues that I have with the system as a whole is we wind up making decisions on some of these just not knowing what we're obligating the taxpayer to. It makes sense what you said to me about monitoring recovery, and you may have no idea, but I'll ask you anyway because I'm trying to get my head wrapped around this. Is there any precedent? Is there any? Are there any other examples you can think of where we've engaged to, in similar fashion for other species, and what that cost has been?
I don't have an analogous. As much as I would like to speculate on something I don't know anything about and often do, in this case, I don't have any data I could.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fulcher. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate this discussion and how we're talking about the role of Congress also in this discussion. First question is for Mr. Schmidt. The United States has migratory bird treaties with Canada, as we pointed out, with Mexico, with Japan, with Russia. And together, the treaties provide protections for over 1,000 species, as we and they protect from unnecessary harm. A lot of the discussion today so far has focused on how the Migratory Bird Treaty Act should be interpreted by the United States. I'd like to kind of expand that to a more international. Can you please explain how other countries interpret the Migratory Bird Treaty Act? In particular, how do they interpret incidental harm of migratory birds, other countries? And the second part of it is, are the international interpretations different than how the United States has interpreted the treaties in the past? Is their interpretation similar to our previous interpretation or the recent interpretation?
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Great question. And in answering it, I'll start by indicating a pen I brought today. It was the replica of the pen that was used to sign the amendments to the migratory bird treaties with Canada and Mexico in the 1990s when I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And during those important negotiations, which I was the career lead in, we specifically had discussions with Canada about that interpretation and reaffirmed the long-standing interpretation that unintentional incidental take was a part of those treaties. And therefore, I can affirm that in the case of Canada, they are very consistent with and have promulgated regulations to that effect over time to provide certainty to the industries that we're talking about. And so that's my greatest experiences with Canada. But I also represented the United States with Russia, Japan, and Mexico, and they are similar, although not as assertive, I would say, and the dialogue never got as deep as what we are having now, and we did have with Canada.
So their interpretation was or was not similar to our previous interpretation?
Very similar to our previous interpretation, previous to the M opinion of 2017.
I'd like to change the topic also a little bit and go to Dr. Rodewald, and that has to do with is there or is there not a sense of urgency to do something now? What is the urgency? And I go to the kind of statement in your report, and I think you mentioned also about how recent high-profile reports have outlined the global biodiversity crisis that our planet is facing. Can you elaborate on that? How much, how large is this? What is the problem that's going on? Not just specifically about incidental take, but the biodiversity. What context do we need to look at?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to answer that. So there have been several recent reports showing that 60% of vertebrate populations have been lost globally since 1970. So that's staggering. That's also consistent with some of the declines we're seeing here in the U.S. So despite our history of conservation, a lot of the positive steps we take, we're not insulated from those kinds of declines. The urgency is manifests in a few ways. For one, we do see a lot of the threats that are facing biodiversity are increasing around the world as our needs to extract resources are changing, continue to increase, that we need to address those. And one of the things I'll mention here, why this is so urgent and this particular bill is so important, is because other legislative mechanisms like Endangered Species Act aren't going to cover many of the species that are currently at risk and are sustaining too high mortality. Right? Where those are facing species that are listed under Endangered Species Act and other laws are dealing with the worst of the worst cases. So we have huge savings we can make. It's much more effective in terms of costs and in terms of the positive outcomes if we take proactive measures. Waiting until species are listed is not going to be a winning strategy, and we're also going to have reduced the environmental and positive benefit and economic benefits we receive long before they're listed.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Ranking Member McClintock is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I think the chairman has misrepresented or at least misunderstood the disapproval resolution on the Green New Deal that he referred to. It actually cites the double standard, the hypocrisy of exempting incidental takings of the Golden Eagle by wind turbines while enforcing them on other forms of energy production, and that's precisely the objection that I think Mr. D'Angelo raised as well with respect to this legislation, and I wanted to highlight that point. Mr. D'Angelo, you pointed out that essentially under this bill, commercial activity is criminalized, but non-commercial activity is not criminalized. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So we're kill the same number of birds. If it's a commercial activity, that is criminal. If it's a non-commercial activity, that's not criminal. To me, that distinction doesn't appear to be aimed at protecting birds. It seems to be aimed at attacking commerce. How do you interpret it?
Well, sir, it's a line drawing exercise. I believe it recognizes that the prior interpretation of the MBTA with expansively covering in strict liability any action, intentional or otherwise, that harms a species, of which there's nearly 1,100 species, basically every bird you see outside, is so absurd that it needed to be pared down in a significant way. I can't speak to the decision as to why to limit to commercial activities instead of all sorts of public activities. I mean, it's certainly not purely based on risk, because I don't want to keep going back to the cats, but there's.
Well, I'm going to get to that point in a second.
Yeah,
but
so it's not based on necessarily fully on risk.
The point is, it's not the incidental taking this bill seems to take exception to. Its commercial activity that it seems to take a dislike to.
Whether it's like or dislike, it's what it is intending to expose to.
We're also told that this is just an affirmation of existing law, nothing to see here, folks, move along. Is that your interpretation of this bill?
It is not. It is not the case that the latest solicitor opinion just dropped out of the ether. The first 50 or so years of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, there were no prosecutions for incidental take. When they started happening, I think the first one was in the 70s, when it happened, incredibly rare. So the latest solicitor opinion, again, that's not even the full context of this interpretation. 10 days before the Obama administration left the office, they asserted, basically the inverse of what the Trump administration asserted, and that's part of the whipsaw back and forth. But it is certainly not the case that, up to that point, until this dropped out of the ether in December of 2017, it was known and unambiguous that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act covered incidental take.
Dr. Rodewald, Mr. D'Angelo just mentioned the taking of birds by cats, and I believe you submitted a table here that I must be missing something, because the way I'm reading this table, cats are estimated to kill 2.4 billion birds each year. Is that correct?
Correct. That's the best estimate.
And oil pits, 750,000. So 2.4 billion birds taken by cats, 750,000 taken by oil pits.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. First, I'll say I'm heartened that you recognize the impact that.
It's stunning. Well, I mean, the imbalance here is stunning. It seemed to me that if we really were serious about protecting the birds, we would be looking at eradicating feral cats that are causing such a high mortality rate. But I also want to, Mr. Chairman, before we recess for votes, I need to submit for the record Congressman Gianforte's statement on his legislation, H.R. 967.
Without objection?
I would also like to submit for the record statement of opposition to the Lowenthal bill by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They point out that at best, This would create uncertainty for a vast range of commercial and industrial activities across the economy, as the need for a permit and thus unduly hinder their operations, increasing the cost for consumers. At worst, it would create a liability scheme for these sectors without any mechanism for relief and without objection.
Without objection.
And finally, I'd like to submit for the record, in lieu of the administration presenting a witness for a panel here today, to submit the U.S. Department of Interior's Officer Solicitor issued memorandum interpreting the take prohibition of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to apply only to affirmative actions that, quote, have as their purpose the taking or killing of migratory birds, their nests, or their eggs, dated December 22nd, 2017.
Without objection. And so, folks, the bad news is votes have been called. We will have to return after votes to continue conversation on the McClintock-Huffman Cat Banning Act of 2019 and other matters. And I especially apologize to the next panel of witnesses, because this is going to be a real inconvenience for you. We're not thrilled about it either. But we have to go to the floor now, and I'm not entirely sure how long it's going to be. We will come back as soon as that vote series is over, and we will pick up with the next panel. So we're going to be recessed temporarily. I apologize again for the inconvenience.
Ms. Folt, the yeas are 275, the nays are 148. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment 49, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 49, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Sean Patrick Maloney of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. vote, the yeas are 266, the nays are 150. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 50, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 50, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Adams of North Carolina.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 358, the nays are 65. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment 51, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 51, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Adams of North Carolina.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic votes. This is a 2-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 307 and the nays are 115. The amendment is adopted. Gavel.
Amendment 52, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109 by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 52, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Byer of Virginia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. Vote. The yeas are 359, the nays are 64. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment 53, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 53, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Byer of Virginia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. vote. The yeas are 285, the nays are 138. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 54, printed in Part B of the House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman of Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 54, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Blunt Rochester of Delaware.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. Vote. The yeas are 376, the nays are 47. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 56, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Murphy, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 56, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mrs. Murphy of Florida.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 366, the nays are 55. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 57, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 57, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 264, the nays are 158. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 58, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 58, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. this vote, the yeas are 91, the nays are 331. Amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 59, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentleman from Utah, Mr. McAdams, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 59, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. McAdams of Utah.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. The yeas are 388, the nays are 30. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 60, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Schreier, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 60, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Schreier of Washington.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. vote, the yeas are 371, the nays are 49. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote. Is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 61, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Lee, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 61, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Lee of Nevada.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 365, the nays are 54. The unfinished business is the amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 62, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 62, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mrs. Craig of Minnesota.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 383, the nays are 36. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 63, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 63, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mrs. Craig of Minnesota.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 376, the nays are 41. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 64, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 64, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mrs. Craig of Minnesota.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. This vote, the yeas are 390, the nays are 29. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 65, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 65, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Porter of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 316. On this vote, the yeas are 316, the nays are 103. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 66, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
66, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Porter of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic vote. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 311, the nays are 110. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 67, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 67, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Porter of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 235 and the nays are 183. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 68, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Mercioso Powell, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 68, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Mucarsel Powell of Florida.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 281, the nays are 138. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 70, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109 by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 70, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Levin of Michigan.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 233, the nays are 187. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 71, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109 by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 71, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Presley of Massachusetts.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 342, the nays are 77, present being 1. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 74, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 74, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Spanberger of Virginia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 364, the nays are 54. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 75, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Delgado, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 75, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Delgado of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 374, the nays are 44. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 76, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 76, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Crow of Colorado.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 345, the nays are 73. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 77, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 77, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Houlihan of Pennsylvania.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 333, the nays are 86. The amendment is adopted. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do not rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All of those in favor say aye. All of those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises. Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2740, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2740 and has come to no resolution thereon. Pursuant to the House Resolution 436 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 2740 Will the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Carson, kindly resume the chair?
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of the bill H.R. 2740, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose earlier today pursuant to House Resolution 431, Amendment number 77, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, had been disposed of. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part B of House Report 116-111, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Mr. Pocan of Wisconsin. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Pasquarel of New Jersey. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 116-111, offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-111, offered by Mr. Pocan of Wisconsin.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. I need that. I'm going to need that. On this vote, the yeas are 225, the nays are 193. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 116-111, offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report Number 116-111, offered by Mr. Pasquale of New Jersey.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote. This vote, the yeas are 382, the nays are 32. The amendment has been adopted. For what purposes does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chair.
The Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2740, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2740 and has come to no resolution thereon.
Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary,
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed, without amendment, H.R. 299, the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act of 2019.
the chair lays before the House a message.
To the Congress of the United States, Section 202D of the National Emergencies Act provides for the automatic termination of a national emergency unless, within 90 days before the anniversary date of its declaration, the President publishes in the Federal Register and transmits to the Congress a notice stating that the emergency is to continue in effect beyond the anniversary date. In accordance with this provision, I have sent to the Federal Register for publication the enclosed notice stating that the national emergency with respect to the actions and policies of certain members of the government of Belarus and other persons to undermine democratic processes or institutions of Belarus that was declared in Executive Order 13405 of June 16, 2006, is to continue in effect beyond June 16, 2019.
Welcome back, folks. Without further ado, and with deep apologies to all of the panelists and everyone else who just had to wait a long time while we cast votes, we're back in session. I don't believe there are other member questions for this panel, and so I apologize that we've kept you waiting for naught, but we're really grateful for your testimony. It was an excellent panel. Your country thanks you, and you are free to go. And with that, we'll ask the third panel to come forward. So while they're coming forward, I'm going to go ahead and introduce this panel. The first witness will be Mr. Grayford Payne from the Bureau of Reclamation. He's the Deputy Commissioner for Policy Administration and Budget. And I understand that Mr. Payne has a flight to catch, and so we'll probably be speaking and then leaving before we can finish the panel and get to member questions. Unfortunately, this is just the kind of thing that happens when we run late like this, so we apologize for that. But next will be Mr. John Allen, Board President of the Water Replenishment District of Southern California. Then we will hear from Anthea Hansen, General Manager of the Del Puerto Water District in California, followed by Mr. Brett Barbary, Director of the Municipal Water District of Orange County. And the final witness will be Mr. Steve Sliver, Executive Director of the PFAS Action Response Team at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And with that, we will welcome Mr. Payne to kick us off. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Huffman, and Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Grayford Payne, Deputy Commissioner of Policy Administration and Budget for the Bureau of Reclamation within the Department of the Interior. Thank you for the opportunity to provide Interior's view on H.R. 967, the Clean Water for Rural Communities Act, H.R. 1162, the Water Recycling Investment and Improvement Act, and H.R. 2473, Securing Access for the Central Valley and Enhancing Water Resources Act. I've summarized my written statements, and I'll use this time to address a few key points. Reclamation's mission is to manage, develop, and protect water-related resources in an environmentally and economically sound manner in the interest of the American public. Reclamation's programs addressed in these three bills, represent part of an all-of-the-above approach that we, Reclamation, employs every day to improve water reliability for Western farmers and families. Rural water projects help build strong, secure communities and are important to supporting the livelihood of local economies. Discretionary rural water funding has enabled Reclamation to make progress in promoting certainty, sustainability, and reliability in support of basic drinking water needs of rural Western communities. However, Reclamation's ability to make federal investments that match the on-the-ground needs has its limitations. Authorized rural water projects compete with other priorities within Reclamation's budget, including basic operation and maintenance needs, aging infrastructure, water, Indian water rights settlements, safety of dams, environmental compliance, restoration actions, developing sustainable water supply strategies, and other activities intended to address future and energy-related challenges. Water reuse and recycling, which is our Title 16 Water Smart program, as part of our all-of-the-above approach, Interior views water reuse and recycling as an important component of the overall water supplies. Earlier this year, the Bureau of Reclamation awarded $35.3 million for 6 authorized Title 16 water reclamation and reuse projects in California. Additionally, $20 million in funding under the WIN Act, part of Title 16, will be selected later this year. This funding will be used to improve flexibility during water shortages and diversify the water supply. The department also views increased surface storage, groundwater recharge, and desalination as important parts of the water supply strategy. H.R. 967, the Clean Water for Rural Communities Act, authorizes the planning, design, and construction of the Musselshell-Judith rural water system in central Montana and would authorize appropriations of 65% of the total project cost. The bill also authorizes the Dry Red Water Regional Water Authority system to continue working with Reclamation to complete their feasibility study. While the department is committed to completing construction of authorized projects, we have concerns about adding to the nearly $1.3 billion backlog of Reclamation's authorized rural water projects seeking federal construction funding. H.R. 1162, the Water Recycling Investment and Improvement Act, amends the Reclamation Wastewater and Groundwater Study and Facilities Act to increase the authorization for Reclamation's Title 16 Water Recycling Competitive Grants Program from $50 million to $500 million and to increase the cost share ceiling to $30 million. While some adjustments for inflation may be appropriate, the program remains successful at the current level, at the current ceiling. H.R. 2473, Securing Access for the Central Valley and Enhancing Water Resources Act, SAVE Act, provides Reclamation with several authorities intended to increase storage, generate innovation, and invest in aging infrastructure, which is part of our overall approach, which I referred to earlier. We look forward to continuing our conversations with Congressman Harder and this committee on modifications to the SAFE Act to make it work best for Valley farmers, communities, and businesses. Reclamation has provided technical assistance on all 3 of the legislation, and we look forward to continuing to work with the committee on these bills. In conclusion, the department is willing to work with the committee on its water supply goals. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify and appreciate the courtesy of letting me catch my flight.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. We appreciate it. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman, for convening today's hearing, and Mr. McClintock, thank you. My name is John Allen, and I am the president of the Board of Directors of the Water Replenishment District of Southern California, or the WRD. WRD appreciates the opportunity to provide our views in support of H.R. 1162 and the Bureau of Reclamation's Title 16 Water Reclamation and Reuse Program. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank Congresswoman Napolitano for her leadership on these issues and for her partnership in our work to secure our region's water future. We are especially grateful for this committee's efforts to combat severe drought and meet the water needs of the American West. As you may know, the Water Replenishment District manages groundwater for over 4 million residents in 43 cities located in southern Los Angeles County. The 420 square mile service area uses approximately 220,000 acre-feet of groundwater per year. Half, 50% of the water used within WRD's service area comes from aquifers, our underground water sources or reservoirs. Through state-of-the-art infrastructure projects and partnerships with government at local, state, and federal levels, the Water Replenishment District has managed groundwater infrastructure responsibly and effectively for nearly 60 years. 60 years in November of this year. The Water Independence Now program, or WIN, is WRD's group of projects and programs designed to protect the security of our groundwater supplies and eliminate the district's need for costly and unreliable imported water. The Elbert Robles Center, formerly known as the Groundwater Reliability Improvement Project, is the cornerstone of the Water Independence Now program, the WIN program, and has been the beneficiary of the Title 16 funds in 2 separate grant awards from the United States Bureau of Reclamation. The Robles Center will introduce a new, local, drought-proof, high-quality, advanced treated water source into one of the most highly urbanized groundwater basins in Southern California, if not America. The completion of this facility will position WRD to become the largest water agency in California to secure 100% of our water supply directly from local sources, recycled water, advanced treated water, and storm water. We applaud the introduction of H.R. 1162 legislation to reauthorize Title 16 water recycling and reuse projects and increase the overall funding level for the program. Our agency is grateful for the funding opportunity created by the Title 16 program and feels strongly that this program represents a sound investment in the future of the American West by the federal government. It is a fact, Title 16 projects create jobs, boost local economy, businesses, and provide long-term savings. These programs represent sound and critical investments in solutions to our water challenges and water sustainability while addressing our drought concerns. Numerous environmental and economic benefits are realized when new water supplies are brought online. For example, in our service area, the Elbert Robles Center will help combat drought and maximize the use of recycled water. It will benefit taxpayers using locally available water as opposed to more costly imported water will stabilize water rates. It will benefit the environment. It is more energy efficient to generate clean water from locally available recycled wastewater than to import water, a process that requires massive amounts of energy to transport the water over hundreds of miles from Northern California and the Colorado River. Title 16 grants help make forward-thinking projects like this possible. Thank you again for your steadfast leadership on these important issues.
Apologize. Mr. McClintock was entertaining me here. Ms. Hanson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Anthea Hanson, and I am on behalf of Del Puerto Water District, I thank you for the opportunity to present testimony on a matter of critical importance, the reliability of water supplies in the western United States. The district was formed in 1947 and receives its water supply from the Bureau of Reclamation through deliveries from the Delta Mendota Canal, a critically important feature of the Central Valley Project. In 1995, the district was reorganized through a formal consolidation with 10 other local districts. The water service contracts of these districts was assigned to Del Puerto, resulting in a contract providing for over 140,000 acre-feet of water annually, making the district one of the largest recipients of agricultural water service in the CVP south of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I have been in the employ of the district for 20 years, and I have been its general manager for 5 years. In my first 3 years as manager, serving the landowners of over 45,000 acres of productive farmland in California's Central Valley, the district's long-term contract provided 2 consecutive years of a 0% supply, followed by a year of 5% supply in 2016. In the years prior to that, during my tenure, the district's supply averaged just 56% of its contract. While I am thankful that drought conditions have at least for now receded, I note for the committee that at a time when California reports a snowpack of over 200% of average, south of the Delta agricultural water service contractors are currently only receiving an allocation of 70%, while an estimated 23.7 million acre-feet, or over 90% of the inflow to our delta, has flowed out uncaptured to the ocean. This is not a sustainable situation for the farmers that grow the food and fiber that feeds our nation and supports the fabric of our rural communities, and it threatens the security and reliability of the United States food supply. If it were its own country, California would boast the world's 5th largest economy, yet it is unable to provide water reliability to a region that produces more than 2/3 of its fruits and nuts and over 50% of the nation's vegetables. This is unacceptable. We know that what must be done to confront this challenge. The solutions require political will to accomplish, as well as a coalition of water and resource managers and their political leaders who are willing to move past the historic water wars to implement the solutions. There are 4 key components to restoring reliability to San Joaquin Valley water supplies. Operate both the state and federal water projects to capture as much water as possible in years such as this one. Increase the conveyance capacity of facilities in our river systems to move water from north to south. Build increased water storage both above ground and below and subsurface. And diversify water supplies, including increasing the use of recycled and reclaimed water, increasing efficiency in water conservation, increasing utilization of technologies to use water as efficiently as possible. H.R. 2473, the Save Water Resources Act, contains helpful tools to begin to restore water supplies to the 200 family farmers served by the Del Puerto Water District and the communities that rely on them. The legislation provides additional funding for WaterSmart grants, creates RIFIA, which would provide low-interest loans to cover up to 49% of project costs, authorizes $450 million in funding from the Reclamation's Title 16 program, and expedites water storage feasibility studies, including those for Sites Reservoir, the Los Vaqueros Reservoir expansion, the Del Puerto Canyon Reservoir, as well as the expansion of the San Luis Reservoir and the related Pacheco Reservoir. There is no one action to make up for all the years that we have failed to improve not only our situation, but the situation for the environment as well. California is miserably lacking in water infrastructure investment. The district and its neighbors continually look for opportunities to increase surface supplies to meet the needs of the region, but additional storage needs to be an integral part of the solution. We need local regional solutions like our proposed Del Puerto Canyon Reservoir. It will be difficult to work to reach an agreement on legislation to wisely manage the West Water now and into the future. It is our responsibility to come together and find a way now. If we don't, we ensure only that water supply reliability will continue to decline and the security of our nation will someday be challenged because we will not have the Central Valley of California to produce a safe and abundant food supply. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee today and look forward to answering any further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hanson. We appreciate it. Mr. Barber, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the subcommittee. My name is Brett Barber, and I'm an elected director of the Municipal Water District of Orange County and also an appointed director of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon as a publicly elected director to share a few thoughts regarding H.R. 2473 and the impacts its passage would have on the California water supply. I've also submitted a written statement providing a broader look at statewide water storage and delivery challenges. We have a water system in California that is broken under the weight of environmental problems and regulations, lack of investment, and outright political obstructionism. I see very little in H.R. 2473 that would help solve these problems. First comment I would make is that in Section 2, you authorize $300 million in FY 2030 to 2060 for water infrastructure and drought solutions. Why wait? This seems to be an attempt to authorize outside the scope of a CBO score. But by delaying the funding, you're sending a clear message that there's really not a problem to be solved. It might feel good to tell those who truly need assistance that help is coming in 11 years, but it really does nothing right now. Second, Section 2B1A of the bill couples surface storage with groundwater storage. These are two very different methods. Surface storage can take large amounts of water very quickly, while groundwater storage requires significantly more time to fill up a basin. With surface storage, one receives multiple benefits: water storage, flood control, recreational opportunities, and power generation. This section should be bifurcated to provide a specific amount for surface storage and a specific amount for groundwater storage. The two can work together, but should be funded separately. An example of those two methods working together would be the MWD Diamond Valley Lake, or DVL. DVL, located in Hemet, was constructed in the late 1990s with MET ratepayer dollars to provide the ability to capture storm flows from either the State Water Project or the Colorado River. This water is to be used for both emergency storage and to be able to slowly recharge the groundwater basins in our service area. In fact, I recall Congresswoman Napolitano was one of the keynotes at the dedication ceremony. Section 4G prohibits the use of tax-free municipal bonds if one participates in the new program, RIFIA. That exact same provision was removed from WIFIA, as most agencies would have avoided utilizing a program which restricted their ability to access the tax-free municipal markets. That provision should be removed. Those of us in California recognize the importance of desal in our future. In fact, I believe about 10% of our future supplies someday will come from desal. However, to the cynics that say Southern California should simply build desal to stop taking their state water project allocation, let me provide a few facts. In order to replace a 2 million acre feet of state water project supply with desal, Metropolitan would need to build coastal desal plants, one every 4.5 miles from Ventura to San Diego. Good luck with the permitting on that. Section 5 is largely unnecessary, but it does recognize the need for more storage in California. It's interesting to note Shasta is not mentioned. Why not? Doesn't it meet the definition of former President Obama's favorite buzz phrase, shovel ready? We've known for decades what's needed to fix the California water system, and that is to complete the State Water Project and build more storage. From January to the end of May this year, 22 million acre feet of fresh water flowed out to the Pacific Ocean. With proper storage and a distribution system that worked, we could have captured most of that. During the same time, CVP and state water exports from the Delta was only 1.7 million acre feet. Storing water away in wet years means more for both the economy and the environment in dry years. We've long tried to run this water system with inadequate storage, and the problem reveals itself every time it stops raining. We need to stop fooling ourselves that we can be the 5th largest economy in the world without a world-class water system that's up to today's challenges. The design of the water system in the Delta needs to be improved so that the water can be captured in the northern Delta, transported to the aqueduct system in the southern Delta. We must remember the supply is vital for the economies of the Silicon Valley, Central Valley, and the $1 trillion Southern California economy. The California water system has been living off investments of the past generations, and a bill of inaction is coming due. What we need in California is a new generation in investment and a new management ethic that doesn't look for reasons to deny water for the economy. Unfortunately, H.R. 2473 falls short. This concludes my statement, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sliver, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. And thanks for this opportunity to talk about the PFAS Detection Act. My name is Steve Sliver, and I am the Executive Director of Michigan's PFAS Action Response Team. And thank you, Congressman Kildee and co-sponsors of H.R. 1976 for your leadership to promote and advance technologies to detect these PFAS compounds and to initiate nationwide survey to better understand the occurrence of them in the environment. Michigan, as well as other states, needs national leadership on standards, and any federal assistance for the sampling of surface water, groundwater, and soil would be very much appreciated. So PFAS are a class of over 5,000 chemicals that have a carbon-fluorine bond, one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. That strong bond gives them their unique and desirable characteristics of being highly stable and heat-resistant. They can also help repel oil and water, reduce friction, facilitate the formation of foam, and disperse coatings across surfaces. The use of PFAS is so widespread across everything from our personal care products to firefighting foams and industrial applications that it's probably easier to list where PFAS are not used rather than where they are. And we're concerned about them because some tend to accumulate in the environment and our bodies, and some have been associated with adverse health effects. We just recently began looking for them, up to 24 in the environment, and we only have limited health and environmental information on some of them. We've got much to learn. And so interest in PFAS contamination began in Michigan with the discovery of very high levels of contamination in groundwater and surface water near military installations that use firefighting foam, and the discovery of widespread contamination from the historic disposal of tannery waste in Rockford, Michigan, grew that interest statewide. As the extent of the challenge to understand the occurrence of the chemicals and how to address them became more clear, the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART, was formed to ensure state agencies were communicating and coordinating an efficient and effective response. Absent any federal protocols, one of the first things we did was develop our own sampling guidance, decide on the analytical methods, and list the compounds to evaluate. The bill proposes the Geologic Survey coordinate with EPA to develop performance standard for the detection of PFAS across all media. This will help ensure proper sampling and analysis of PFAS across the country, lead to new technologies that provide a more thorough evaluation of PFAS, and guide better investigations and public health responses. MPART has coordinated the investigations of hundreds of known and suspected sites of PFAS contamination. We have this many because we're looking, not because we have more contamination than anyone else. The PFAS Detection Act will help prioritize the sampling by the Geologic Survey near sites like these and identify additional sites across the country. That is the model MPART has used, and it works for protecting public health. We have rapidly sampled private wells near these contaminated sites and discovered several thousand Michiganders in need of alternate water supply. MPART is also systematically surveying our drinking water supplies and surface waters. This data helps us identify and protect residents who are exposed to unacceptably high concentration of PFAS in their drinking water, and to track down and eliminate discharges of PFAS into our waterways that are affecting our drinking water intakes and the fish we consume. The data also helps us to understand the need for any new regulations, like enforceable drinking water standards. We know from statewide testing of all community water supplies that 97% don't have PFAS contamination issues today, but all that testing did not cover everyone, including 25% of our residents on their own private well. Additional sampling by the Geologic Survey, as described in this bill, could provide much-needed data on sources of PFAS contamination and broaden our coverage of the state's and nation's drinking water supply. We appreciate the provision in the bill for the Geologic Survey to consult with the states. Michigan has a considerable amount of data, and we also have developed protocols to use the best available science and data to drive our next steps in our investigations. Our protocols include having a detailed plan for how to share and respond to the results, especially when testing drinking water. The Geologic Survey will get results that require a public health response, and planning for that now is important. Lastly, this bill highlights the need for funding. Michigan alone has allocated over $50 million in the past 2 years to address PFAS contamination. So on behalf of MPART, we really look forward to further discussion on H.R. 1976. It can be an important vehicle to establish nationally recognized standards for the detection of PFAS and helping us better understand the occurrence of them throughout the environment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the panel. We'll now bring it back to questions of the members. Did you want to begin, Ms. Napolitano?
Yes, sir, Mr. Huffman. Thank you very much. Both Mr. Allen and Mr. Barber, is the drought over in Southern California?
No.
We live in a perpetual state of drought, but we figured out how to work around the drought.
But right now, the aquifers aren't full.
Well, in Orange County, the aquifers are mostly full. We've also invested in groundwater replenishment system, which takes the sewer water, treats it to perfect standards, and sends it right back to the groundwater system.
So without recycled water, you'd be in a pickle.
Well, I would say without imported water. It's actually all of the above that we need. Imported water, local supplies, desal, groundwater replenishment.
Thank you. Mr. Allen, what is the cost of recycling water?
If I may answer that for just a second, I believe we've been in a drought since the early months of 2007. That's 12 years. We've had some good rain years, but last year we had less than 5 inches. And we definitely need to replenish our underground aquifers, our reservoirs, to keep our aquifers full.
Next question would be, what is the cost of recycled water now?
We have a plant that's going to put water in the ground without imported water. Imported water costs about $1,100 an acre foot if you get it from Metropolitan. We will put it in the ground so that it would cost $365 to pump. And of course, you have your basic pumping, which is $220 to $250 an acre foot. So you put those both together, you're still under $600, or just about half of what it would cost to buy Metropolitan water.
So, Mr. McClintock, your figures are wrong. You can get it from people who are actually doing the research, the work. The next question would be not a question, but a statement to Ms. Hansen. Northern California has a great amount of agriculture, which they maintain. It's always been said, not my figures either, that Northern California uses 80% of California's water. Southern California gets 20%. You use it mostly for ag. Certainly there's other uses for it. But Southern California uses it for people, for business, and for some of the agriculture. So I find it a little hard to give more water to Northern California. However, if we are able to recycle more and meld it with potable water, then Northern California can have their water, because then we won't need as much, and very little, as he was pointing out. And the same thing for, I think, the Orange County is also doing the same thing. They're going to be off potable water by 2030, do I hear?
Not Orange County, no. We're always going to need imported water.
But what amount?
Well, roughly 50% of Orange County's water supply is imported either through the State Water Project or from the Colorado River. And that's pretty much the same throughout the entire Met service area. And that's why it's been critical that we have both 2 import sources and also a development of local resources. The local resources and conservation generally is for growth.
Mr. Allen?
Thank you. My agency has become independent of Metropolitan Water. I've imported water from Northern California and Colorado River. Metropolitan is a very good partner of ours, and under their LERP plan, they have given us $1 million to help construct our new advanced water treatment facility in Pico Rivera. So we'll be off that. And our plan going forward is to get our 43 cities off of imported water. And we're going to do that. We're going to work on the brackish water in the West Coast Basin. That's our next step. But we have 3 other steps after that.
And you need the help of government to do what?
We need the help of the Bureau of Reclamation to take 600,000 acre feet of brackish water that's in the West Basin and bring it up and clean it up and desalinate it and put it back in there and create 600,000 acre-feet of reservoir space below ground that we can use to capture whenever we have a rainy year like we had this year and like we had 2 years ago. We could fill that up and we could continue to be independent, but we need that money now, or not now, but in the next couple of years to build that plant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Recognize Ranking Member McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Barber, you asked a very important question. Why wait? Mr. Harder himself told us that this is urgent. We need to get started right away, and then he doesn't, in his bill, make provisions for these projects until 2030. And these projects, by the way, are not shovel-ready. They are for study. And he ignores Shasta, which is ready to proceed. What do you make of all of that? Is this urgent or not?
You know, I always hear that it's urgent, that we need to make these fixes. I know in Southern California, we've been trying to get the State Water Project fixed for 50 years. And they're still studying it. And it's what I call analysis paralysis, where we just study things to death. We never build anything. The only reason I can see putting it out to 2030 is so you can avoid a 10-year CBO score.
One of the provisions he has is to conflate both surface water storage and underground storage as basically the same thing. Are they the same thing in terms of efficiency?
Not the same thing at all. You cannot capture large storm flows with groundwater basins. You have to put it in a holding basin. That's why that's why we built Diamond Valley Lake, so we could take those huge storm flows and save it and then slowly let it go into the groundwater basins, like in Orange County and WRD places.
Diverting money from surface water storage to groundwater storage, of course, means two things then. Less surface water storage and less total water storage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Shasta, the estimated cost per acre foot is $2,200. That's completely ignored in this legislation, as I said, but we have sites at $2,800, Los Vaqueros at $6,900, Del Puerto Canyon at $5,800 per acre foot, and San Luis Reservoir at $4,100 per acre foot, rounded to the nearest 100. Does that make any sense economically?
Well, obviously raising Shasta makes a lot of sense. You get 18.5 feet, get 634,000 acre feet of increased storage. It is expensive, but in the long run, it's better to have that. Some of the other reservoirs are much smaller footprint, but I still think it's important. I think it's important to contrast the Colorado River storage with the State Water Project storage. Colorado River has an average flow of 15 million acre feet a year. Yet they have 60 million acre feet of storage. So when those huge storms come, they capture every single drop of water, snow, whatever it may be. In California, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta has average flows of 32 million acre feet. Yet they only have 16 million acre feet of storage available. Having 50% of average flows is never going to get you in a situation other than being in a perpetual drought.
And
we need to get beyond that.
We lost about 22 million acre feet to the ocean?
Already this year, exactly.
Well, Mr. Allen, wouldn't that be helpful in your district? 22 million acre feet of water? That's a rhetorical question, never mind. I need to go on because I want to cover these numbers. These come from the EPA. They're a study of the costs of water for San Diego, which is at the end of California's water pipeline. They provide a range, and the mean in that range is desal, $2,300 per acre foot, water recycling, $1,500, imported water, that expensive stuff that Mr. Allen was talking about, $925, groundwater, $737, and surface water storage, $600 per acre foot. So $600 per acre foot for surface water storage is the mean average reported by the EPA for San Diego. Desal, $2,300. So I'd ask you, what's better, 1 gallon or 4 gallon for the dollar?
Well, I think you're going to need a mix. Desal, I don't think we're ever going to run out of the ocean anytime soon, so that's helpful.
Yeah, but we can't guarantee enough electricity right now to keep people's air conditioning running this summer, let alone their refrigerators.
I agree. The problem in the state of California is they're taking away all of the abilities to generate electricity. They won't even count hydro as green power.
Well, and again, it comes down to, we keep hearing all the time, well, we need all of the sources in our water toolbox as if they're all the same, but they're not all the same. Some of them are extremely expensive, which means putting our money there, it means perpetual water shortage. Ms. Hanson, do you think that's really good public policy to treat the most expensive sources of water the same as we treat the cheapest?
No, sir, but I do think that different locations have different variables, and I do think that some of the projects make more sense in one area than another. I know that Del Puerto Canyon Reservoir
Of course they do,
before,
but again, I
before,
do think you would agree that abundance is better than shortage. I've got one more question I've got to ask you.
We're
real
out of
quick.
time, Mr. Ranking Member.
Well, you've given a lot of time to some of the Democrats over the amount. So
How quickly
just this
can
one quick question. How important do you believe it is to extend the operational issues in the WIN Act? Ms. Hanson.
I would agree that it would be a very beneficial thing for the
We're going to have to leave it with that.
acres
You think that's a good idea? That'll be where it stands because we've got to keep moving.
It will need to be the will of Congress.
Understood. Thank you. I'm going to recognize myself now for 5 minutes. The cognitive dissonance in here is getting pretty loud. Mr. McClintock is citing numbers that bear no relation to reality. Now, maybe San Diego can somehow pencil out $600 per acre foot for existing surface water storage, but you will not find new surface water storage in the state of California at $600 an acre foot. Certainly not without wild economic acrobatics that involved contriving public benefits and subsidies layered on these projects to artificially drive down the cost, and even then it won't be $600 per acre foot. If you can find a new surface water storage project for $600 an acre foot, I will eat a reverse osmosis membrane. Okay?
That's a challenge.
Now, I've just heard withering criticism about this idea of Mr. Harder's bill calling for reclamation fund spending 10 years out. This is to avoid a CBO scoring problem. I get that, but suddenly there's this great desire to accelerate it. Well, my friends across the aisle are opposed to the mandatory spending in that reclamation fund proposal. So were we to immediately begin that mandatory spending, my friends across the aisle would immediately turn around and oppose it. So I find this to be disingenuous and at best confusing. Similarly, some of your testimony, Mr. Barbary, I appreciate the desire to have projects and water supplies that can be brought online quickly because there is a lot of urgency. But to then turn around and say that we need to dedicate a whole bunch of this fund to surface water storage projects instead of whatever projects can pencil out and move forward the fastest is at odds with what you say you want, because those are the slowest projects. They're the ones that take the longest. You won't get water from a new surface water storage anytime soon. They're many, many years out. And the Shasta project that some folks keep holding out as a holy grail. Let me just remind everyone, the Shasta project is illegal under California law. That's why it hasn't moved forward. That's why it's not going to move forward. The state of California is in court right now suing to make sure that there is no construction activity on this project. And the Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner testified in this committee strongly indicating that it would take a specific act of Congress directing construction, notwithstanding state law. We haven't done that for over 100 years. The Western governors are going to hate it. Most water users in California are going to hate the fact that you're running roughshod over state law, but I guess some folks want to keep pretending that this illegal Shasta Dam project is shovel-ready and just about ready to build, I guess if we can lavish enough federal subsidies on it to make it pencil out. Mr. Allen, I was impressed with your testimony and the strategy of trying to develop as much self-reliance as possible for the communities you serve so that you're not dependent on these far-flung water import projects, which carry with them a lot of uncertainty and vagary. And as we look out with climate change and environmental conflicts, it seems to me that you've placed a pretty good bet by developing that kind of certainty into your water supply, especially with costs of imported water from MWD being $1,100 or so, as you state. Talk about the advantages of having a supply that you can control and having wet water that you can actually count on rather than some of these abstractions we've been talking about with other options.
Certainty and predictability help business and commerce develop that provides jobs, provides a thriving economy, provides a good place to live. And that's what Southern California is, and that's what we want to keep, and that's what we want to do by making sure there's no earthquakes that interrupt the supply of water from Northern California, no earthquakes that interrupt the supply of water from the Colorado River. These are all possibilities that we don't want to think about.
And you're not alone here. A growing number of Southern California communities, including metropolitan contractors, have seen the benefits of this strategy of developing more local and regional supplies. I know Long Beach and the city of Los Angeles itself, San Diego for many years has been broadening its water supply portfolio.
Metropolitan Water District is developing the Carson sewage treatment plant that puts anywhere between 250 million gallons a day of treated sewage into the Pacific Ocean. And they want to develop that into recycled water to use in the basin, perhaps Orange County, perhaps Upper San Gabriel Reservoir, perhaps with us. That would be a tremendous source of water that needs to be developed locally, and that would also use Bureau of Reclamation Title 16 funds, or would be eligible to apply for it.
Let me just say, as someone who's worked on water for many years, and as a Northern Californian, we don't mind sharing our water with the rest of the state, but it sure helps if we've got partners in other parts of the state that are also trying to develop the water supplies locally and regionally that can allow us to have healthy rivers and good water quality and salmon populations in our part of the state as well. So thanks for your leadership on that.
You're welcome, and it also saves electricity.
Right. All right. Mr. Kilda, you've been very patient. Let me recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, this important hearing, but particularly for inviting me to participate because of the subject that I have spent so much time on. I am particularly happy to be able to be a part of this hearing and to be in this hearing room where my predecessor in Congress, my Uncle Dale, served for 34 of his 36 years in Congress. So I personally take some pride in being able to be here. So I also want to thank Mr. Sliver for coming from Michigan to testify today on H.R. 1976, the PFAS Detection Act. I've worked very closely with Congressman Jack Bergman from the northern part of my state, along with Senator Stabenow and other members of Congress on this legislation. I represent Oscoda, Michigan, which is a small rural community. It's home to the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base, which at one time was part of the Strategic Air Command's B-52 fleet. In fact, I remember as a kid watching those planes come and go. Now, though, sadly, according to the GAO, Wurtsmith is one of 401 military sites having known or potential releases of PFAS after decades, in this case, of firefighting foam being used by the military on that location. This toxic firefighting foam leached into the groundwater and has contaminated the drinking water in the community of Oscoda. And that is the issue that led me to this subject, and that's why I formed the bipartisan Congressional PFAS Task Force with my friend, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania. The task force has over 50 members of Congress, not just limited to Michigan, because we hear from virtually members from all over the country on this issue. So, Mr. Sliver, as you mentioned in your testimony, Michigan has hundreds of known and suspected sites of PFAS contamination. And we know this not necessarily, as you said, because our state has more contamination than anyone else, but because our agencies have been actively looking for it. Help us understand why it's important that we find out where this PFAS contamination is, number one. And secondly, if you could comment on how pervasive you believe, I know we don't want to get ahead of the science, but what you suspect might be the case in terms of how pervasive PFAS is likely to be found throughout the state of Michigan.
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. Yes, I think, first, we're all about protecting public health. That is our job number one when it comes to MPART and coordinating all of the other state agencies And our goal is to identify and reduce exposures to people in their drinking water of PFAS. And so in order to do that, we need to know where these sites of contamination are. And so we have a very systematic approach in Michigan of looking at known and suspected sites of contamination, and we also have reconnaissance sampling of our surface waters and groundwater as proposed in this bill for a nationwide survey by the Geologic Survey, and we also test our public water supplies, again trying to understand the occurrence of these compounds, and then where we do find them above a concentration that the health experts tell us is something that is too high, then we can work immediately to reduce those concentrations. And I'm sorry, the second part of the question?
Like how broad or how ubiquitous do you believe PFAS will likely to be determined in the state of Michigan?
Well, you know, we're finding it in our drinking water, we're finding it in surface water, we're finding it in wastewater, we're finding it in landfills, which take all of the waste materials from society when they're no longer useful to us. We're finding it in fish tissue, we're finding it in deer tissue. And so I don't know exactly where they are, but given how ubiquitous they are in society, you know, we would not be surprised to find them in many different media. And I think that's really the value of having a very systematic approach to looking across the country in all the different media to say, okay, where should we be targeting our efforts given what we're finding in all these media?
And lastly, because I have limited time, I wonder if you just might comment on why it's so expensive to deal with this subject. I mean, this $45 million relative to the downstream cost of not locating it is nothing, but it is expensive to address PFAS. Could you just touch on briefly why it is so expensive?
Well, sure, exactly. The analytical costs alone are very expensive. We were paying over $500 per single drinking water sample last year. Costs have come down a little bit, but there's not a lot of capacity nationally to address that. Plus, all the models that we've been using to understand how these behave in the environment they don't work for PFAS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will note that the room that we are in is named for Morris K. Udall, who I met 41 years ago, as you now know, when I came down here to testify as a young...
I think you should share that picture of
I
you
may
41
share that
years
photo
ago
of
with
Mr.
everyone.
Udall, but not of the young Dan
Unrecognizable.
standing next to him. Again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of the witnesses. Very valuable testimony. This is extremely important subject matter, and you can count on further efforts by this committee to move some of these solutions forward to the extent we can. Members of the committee may have some additional questions. For the witnesses, we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Or 3.0, members of the committee must submit those questions in writing within 3 business days following this hearing, and the record will be held open for 10 business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business, this subcommittee is adjourned.